Thank you and good morning. A familiar strand of Wagner reception during the 19th century points to the galvanic effect of his music. One representative example comes from the Jewish feuilletonist Julius Klein, who complained in 1871 of, quote, the wild Wagnerian corybantic orgy, with orchestral accompaniments slapping you in the face, hence the secret fascination that makes it the darling of feeble-minded royalty who need this galvanic stimulation by massive orchestral treatment to throw their pleasure-weary frogs' legs into violent convulsion. In a slightly different vein, the Anglo-German critic Francis Hofer spoke of Wagner's conducting explicitly in terms of animal magnetism, whose effect of overpowering consciousness was commonly attributed to the mysteries of cerebral electricity. Hofer speaks of each player under Wagner's baton being, quote, equally under the influence of a personal fascination, which seems to have much in common with the effects of animal magnetism. As writers from Elliot Galkin to Alison Winter have noted, the Revue Trimestrielle's pictorial caricature from the 9th of January 1864 shows Wagner and Berlioz engaged in a mesmeric battle, putting each other to sleep via the proxy of their musical scores. Baton in hand, you can see Berlioz on the left losing the battle. In the context of debates over mesmerism's basis in electrophysiology, this obliquely implicates an active force generated by voltaic current coursing through the composer's musical brains. And as late as 1924, Maurice Baring's autobiographical novel C recounts an experience of hearing Tannhäuser in similar terms. After the performance, the narrator reports, quote, Maurice was stunned by these magnetic effects of sound. Never did he receive a more violent electric shock. Now, one reading of these quite distinct critical reactions to Wagner was that they used the material impulses supplied by electricity to explain what it is they want to say about Wagner's music. As is well known, this ranged from perceived psychological effects to measured physiological ones. While at one level it is possible to read such criticism as mere hyperbole that borrows from the resources of natural science, at another level we might also ask what cultural work this borrowing accomplishes and what structures of knowledge it reveals. Looking back on the post-Napoleonic period, Walter Benjamin likened the significance of electricity to that of Christianity under Tiberius in the 1st century. I quote, this general infusion of energy was of greater consequence and better able to change the future than any political event, he explained. The examples of Wagner criticism just cited tap into a wider materialist discourse on galvanism and animal electricity that dates back to the writings of Erasmus Darwin and William Lawrence in England, Marie Bichet in France, and was imported into Germany by physiologists such as Heinrich Zollber and Émile Dubois-Reymond. While Wagner was certainly aware of theories concerning galvanic stimulation, referring in 1841 to the materialist doctrine that the soul, quote, consists of carbonic acid and galvanism, end quote, it is nevertheless hard to see him as a materialist in this context. His description of Alexander von Humboldt and Hermann von Helmholtz in 1878 as mere Schopenhauerian donkeys is indicative of the manner in which he tended to resist the perspective of the natural sciences. That, of course, didn't prevent others from interpreting his works in light of the scientific discourses of the age. Now, in this talk, I'd like to explore the relevance of electrophysiology and its corollary model for communication for Wagner criticism during the 19th century. Early advocates of this field maintained that research into electricity and other physical forces would ultimately reveal the connection between neural structure and mental function, yielding a kind of natural science of the soul. Back in 1769, Herder, in the 4th of his Kritische Wälder, had challenged the scientific community to explain music in this sense, scrutinizing the emotions we experience when listening in the same way one would analyze color in a painting. He states, can you feel and think at the same time and catch the moment flying past to fix it for eternity? Then tell, then create a science that lies yet in the womb of feeling, end quote. As Edward Reed first pointed out, materialist investigations into the soul were censored across Europe as radical and atheistic during the early decades of the century. Prosecutions of publishers and radical surgeons, such as William Lawrence, meant that the discourse initially found expression through literary fiction. Hence, it is works such as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and E.T.A. Hoffmann's Meister Floh that document the manner in which electrophysiology promised a potential answer to Herder's call. And while this aspect of scientific discourse may appear removed from the currents of critical opinion that surrounded opera at the time, it is also the case that within the context of widely disseminated print media, ideas circulate promiscuously and chaotically, often articulated by fashionable keywords, where associations accrue through varied reiteration and metaphor rather than clear articulation. Caricatures of galvanism raising the dead would be a case in point, and this was from London in 1836. But what, if anything, is Wagner's relation to electrophysiology and its associated science of feeling? The answer is admittedly oblique. In opera and drama, he writes of the way that physical experiences are transmitted materially between performer and listener. I quote, "The sensation manifested in this melody," he explains, "is a phenomenon which now belongs to us, to whom it has been imparted, as much as to him who has imparted it." End quote. Speaking of animal sensation, in 1858, he wrote in a similar vein to Mathilde Wesendonck of compassion, or Mitleid, as a projection of fatally sympathetic nerves. "The question here is not what the other person suffers," he implored, "but what I suffer when I know him to be suffering. How I imagine it is how it is for me. So my fellow suffering makes the other person's suffering a reality." End quote. In his dramatization of anti-vivisectionism in Parsifal, Mitleid forms the recurring motto. The hunted swan is real, unlike Lohengrin's Gottfried, and dies by the iron and wood of Parsifal's arrow, becoming a faint introduction, via his mother's pain, to the searing wound Amfortas must suffer, and for which Parsifal ultimately will feel physical compassion. 2 years after the premiere of Parsifal, the writer and Wagner acolyte Friedrich von Hauseger duly raised the question of compassion as a function of expression. That is how we comprehend the expression of others. The expression Mitleid, he explains, is also applicable in a purely physiological sense. The similarity of someone in sympathy goes so far that we even feel affected in the same organs and in the same way as the sufferer. Not only pain, however, but also other physical conditions are felt sympathetically and arouse similar phenomena in others. Thus, the conditions of sneezing, yawning, laughing, crying, and especially conditions of deep excitement. This sympathetic reactivity at the level of physiology offers a new shading of knowledge through compassion, or durch Mitleid wissend, and the gulf between Parsifal's spiritual revelation and Hauseger's yawning encapsulates a tension within views of musical expression at the time. This, after all, is Hauseger's explanation for the physical means by which we understand musical experience. It is a non-conscious reflex, he maintains, and works as a kind of instinctive receptivity or congenital attentiveness, as he put it. The idea that voices on stage will elicit sympathetic reactions from auditors and that this is principally a physical process is a striking claim. So what was its rational basis? Well, half a century after Galvani had used electric current to induce twitching from the legs of dead frogs, an altogether different implication for human cognition arose from his concept of animal electricity, namely that electrical impulses from the cerebrum were the material trace of artistic impulses and could even be decoded to create art. Alexander von Humboldt's experiments in Jena during 1797 had seemingly verified Galvani's view that electric current had an internal source in the nerves and brain. During the 1850s, this suspicion was embodied most notably in an invention called the psychograph, whose sole agency was given as nervous electricity. The 1854 patent, described variously as a psychograph or thought indicator, reads as follows. The apparatus consists of a combination of rods or pieces of wood joined so as to permit a free action in all the parts. From one of the legs of the instruments hangs a tracer. On one or more of the other extremities is fixed a disc, upon which the operator is to place his hand, and from this extremity, or these extremities, depends another tracer. The other parts of the apparatus consist of a glass slab or other non-conductor, and of an alphabet and set of figures or numerals. And this is the key point now. Upon a person possessing nervous electricity placing his hand upon one of the discs, the instrument will immediately work, and the tracer will spell upon the alphabet what is passing in the operator's mind. Useful, to be sure. Freiherr von Fortner, a colleague of the inventor, reported that several such devices were apparently sold in California, and to advertise the sale, no fewer than 4 psychographically induced poems were published. These were attributed to supposedly inartistic and not especially literate Prussian citizens. Despite containing no punctuation and often with no spaces between the words, a 12-year-old girl apparently psychodrafted poem A on screen between 9 and 10 p.m. on the 13th of March, 1853, and a first lieutenant in the Prussian army wrote poem B 7 days later. So while hardly a challenge to the literary elite, psychographically induced literature promised to socialize the concept of genius by virtue of producing poetry directly through the agency of one's endogenous electricity. Indeed, the appeal of the device for early commentators rested partly on the assumption that anybody could tap into their genius in this sense. Skeptical commentators protested, notably within Humboldt's circle, that the psychograph was really only the latest of a string of monstrous absurdities of the age. While medical researchers have since decoded brain synapses into verbal messages, at the time this invention was clearly a scam, and by the 1890s its proto-scientific claims for electrical agency were replaced by spirits, as it definitively entered the realm of occult fantasy, and actually it would split in two directions, going to technology of the lie detector and the Ouija board. Nevertheless, the specific belief that thought and the experience of emotion could be reified as material substance, and that electricity carried this, whether as fluid or synaptic impulse through the nervous system, was given empirical credence in the 1850s by a circle of academic materialists associated with the Prussian Academy of Sciences. First to put the case among them was Carl Vogt, a professor of zoology at the University of Geneva, who declared in his Physiological Letters of 1854, quote, "All those capabilities that we understand by the term activities of the soul are just functions of brain substance. Thoughts in themselves stand in relation to the brain as gall to the liver or urine to the kidney," end quote. Jakob Moleschott, a prominent colleague in Heidelberg, regarded such comparative logic as, quote, "incontestable," adding that thought is movement, a conversion of brain substance. And such ideas percolated into musical discourse, with the writer and pedagogue Gustav Nauenberg declaring himself, quote, "a warm, if not absolute, admirer of phrenological science," to the readers of the Neue Zeitschrift in 1851. He related how different areas of the brain correspond to different musical aptitudes. This is 1851, continuing that, quote, "mental immaterial force acts from the brain like magnetic or electrical force. It appears as the expression of the material's activity," end quote. At root, such beliefs testify to a nascent theory of communication, of how ideas are transmitted in material form between individuals across physical spaces, including between stage and audience, one that we might usefully consider in light of what James Treadwell recently called Wagner's urge to communicate. During the 1850s, moreover, the dominant metaphor for communication within human neural networks was not the psychograph, but an alternative means of transmitting ideas. In the same year as Nauenberg's article on phonology, the widely respected experimental physiologist Émile Dubois-Reymond suggested that, quote, "the wonder of our time, electrical telegraphy, was long ago modeled in the animal machine. But the similarity between the two apparatus, the nervous system and the electric telegraph, has a much deeper foundation. It is more than similarity. It is a kinship between the two, an agreement not merely of the effects, but also perhaps of the causes," end quote. This isomorphism between nerves and telegraph wires is playfully elaborated into a conceit for the very structures of urban colonial life. Quote, "For just as the central station of the electric telegraph in the post office in Königstrasse is in communication with the outermost borders of the monarchy through its gigantic web of copper wire, just so the soul in its office, the brain, endlessly receives dispatches from the outermost limits of its empire through its telegraph wires, the nerves, and sends out its orders in all directions to its civil servants, the muscles," end quote. The metaphor was in fact quite common. We find it explicitly in Hanslick's von Musikalisch Hören, which refers to music as, quote, "the imperceptible telegraph service between brain and soul," wherein musical performance, quote, "coaxes the electric spark out of its obscure secret place and flashes it across to the listener." And as Alison Winter has shown, Berlioz's experiment in coordinating multiple conductors with the same beat using an electric baton literalized the notion of a conductor and was duly caricatured as a telegraphic net conducting musical time around the globe. Essentially what he tried to do was to coordinate different conductors who couldn't necessarily see one another using an electric pulse with an electric baton. So it's a sort of a click track avant la lettre. While some physiologists doubted the veracity of any knowledge gained about the nervous system based on what are essentially a series of comparisons, the relationship between metaphor and knowledge appeared to work both ways. Notable scientific figures backed Raymond's reading, among them Samuel Morse and Helmholtz. Morse predicted in 1832 that if the presence of electricity can be made visible, I see no reason why intelligence might not be instantaneously transmitted by electricity to any distance, end quote. And in 1850, Helmholtz adapted techniques from ballistics to measure the velocity with which intelligence was transmitted, specifically along the sciatic nerve of a frog. By varying the position of an electrode along the nerve, he concluded that the speed of signal transmission in organic telegraphy was 26.4 meters per second. Now, this is the speed, in other words, at which listeners were thought to react physiologically to the impulses of the auditory nerve in the opera house or the concert hall. Given this contemporary knowledge and the fact that the metaphor of telegraphy appeared to slip freely between scientific texts and literary fiction, with direct links to musical figures such as Hoffmann and Hanslick, there would seem plausible grounds for adopting it as a hermeneutic tool for interpreting Wagner's mature works, where the need to communicate is basic to the genre. So, moving on to this different part of the paper now, one modern instance of this would be Keith Warner's engagement with the broader scene of Victorian science in his 3 recent public productions of The Ring at Covent Garden. Here you see him depicting Nibelheim as a laboratory for perverse science. In this particular picture we see evocations of Fritz Lang's Maria and, of course, Frankenstein. This is from the most recent production. This is Alberich with a Tarnhelm Rubik's Cube device here, and of course explicit eugenics just following. But aside from this kind of interpretation, a more historical interpretation is also possible. Consider Elsa's slow scream into the foreground for Lohengrin to defend her honor in Act 1 of Lohengrin. This commands the Swan Knight over a distance of some 400 miles, the distance between her duchy in Brabant and his holy mountain at Montsalvat. For Friedrich Kittler, this is, quote, an impossible exploit. Barely audible sounds freed from the speaker's mouth and will have grown to an absolute sound that travels through space and time, end quote. That is, it anticipates the invention of radio waves. For Alexander Redding, this feat of acoustic transmission even conjures the spectacle of the electric telephone. At the risk of domesticating what Wagner called a poetic miracle here, Redding's insight is less dependent on a post-structuralist perspective than we might first assume. In March 1848, just in time for the finished score of Lohengrin, Punch advertised what it called a telekuphonon, or speaking trumpet, that purported to carry the human voice across great distances using a series of insulated tubes so that, quote, a priest may give his sermon simultaneously in 3 different churches, end quote. Or that by laying down a number of these devices, quote, domestic establishments might be served with the liquid notes of Jenny Lind as easily as they are with soft water, and could be supplied with music as readily as they can with gas, end quote. Beyond the fad for such eccentric theories, Nietzsche would later return the telephone analogy explicitly to Wagner's music. He relished the clash of technology and metaphysics when describing music's new Schopenhauerian empowerment in Wagner's orchestra as, quote, a priest, a sort of mouthpiece of the in itself of things, a telephone from the beyond. While this remains a poetic metaphor, and unlike Raymond's telegraphy, doesn't imply any kind of isomorphic relationship, it finds an uncanny analogue with a number of contemporary models for sensory communication within the animal system. One such, from the prominent scientist and philosopher Rudolf Hermann Lotze, outlined a telegraphic process by which sound, color, or taste is transmitted and perceived. In his Medizinische Psychologie of 1852, Lotze separated the stimulus and transmission of sensation from its effect, stating, quote, there is nothing in the redness of red, the blueness of blue, or the sound of the heard tone which suggests a larger or smaller number of vibrations of a medium, end quote. He then proceeds to liken the way a stimulus is transformed into its perceived effect to the electric telephone, quote. Effects or actions which proceed from things themselves and are sent stimuli to us are no doubt only motions and themselves neither red nor sweet. But what is there to prevent our supposing that by acting through our nerves, they make the same redness or sweetness arise as our sensations in our souls, which also attaches as a quality to the things themselves? Such a process would be no more wonderful than the telephone, which receives waves of sound, propagates them in a form of motion quite different, and in the end conducts them to the ear to retransformed into waves of sound. So Elsa's scream, in other words, reaches the listener's soul in precisely the same way that it reaches Lohengrin at Montsalvat. It is transmitted and transformed as sound via motion along nerves or electric cable, underscoring a parallelism between music and physics, or what could almost be called, after Herder, a science of musical feeling. Nietzsche would famously invert the metaphor of telegraphy in the repudiatory second preface to The Birth of Tragedy. Far from communicating thoughts and sensations clearly, here it was co-opted for the opposite purpose, to convey sensory confusion, bewilderment, or even pain. Alluding to Parsifal, he warns that recent German music is, quote, the greatest corrupter of the nerves, doubly dangerous to a nation given to hard drinking, and one that hails lack of clarity as a virtue for its double power to intoxicate and to befog the mind, end quote. But the flip side to such criticism, the aspiration behind a desire to take control of the assumed electrosensory operation when listening to music, is the fixing of the listener's response by closing the gap between conscious assessment and sensory immersion. The net effect, Nietzsche feared, was a kind of guaranteed physiological judgment in the listener, which he dubbed belief without words. At one level, this captures Wagner's urge to communicate, to effectively telegraph his art, if you like, directly to the cerebrum. At another level, however, this psychotechnical control, as Adorno would later call it, denied requisite freedoms to disagree with or disconnect from the source. This technological hostility to consciousness, Adorno claims darkly, quote, is the very foundation of the music drama. The style becomes the sum of all the stimuli registered by the totality of the senses, end quote. Here the listener becomes firmly implicated and potentially even encoded in a sensory economy. As the figure on screen shows, to which John referred earlier, André Gilles' 1869 caricature depicts Wagner drawing blood from a collective oversized ear by hammering a physical quarter note directly into the auditory nerve. This captures something of the literalism of this material mode of communication, and it was Nietzsche, writing as a classicist, who famously recognized that Wagner had thereby reconciled the physical and intellectual components of sensory experience, sensual experience, which had been separated in Western culture under the influence of Hellenistic philosophy. Recent commentaries in the realm of media aesthetics have put this reconciliation more acerbically. In 1990, Norbert Bolz proceeds from the assumption that the physiological a priori of thought response is not hermeneutic, but media technological, writing provocatively, quote, Wagner's music is the first to get on your nerves. All we need to do is hook up the audience's bared nerve ends with electric cable to enter the world of the new media, end quote. So finally, associations then of electrophysiology split in two different directions, telegraphic communication and sensory immersion. Descriptions of the effects of Wagner's music drew on both, and while there is always a danger that metaphor is a tail that wags the dog, it would seem too easy merely to dismiss electrophysiology as a floating signifier in this context. The linguist Jakel Olaf argued recently that scientific metaphors typically form, quote, coherent cognitive models, complex gestalt structures of organized knowledge, end quote. As we saw, Lotze argued that there is a fully isomorphic relationship between sense perception and the telephone, while Raymond claimed the same for nerves and telegraphic wires. And here it is perhaps worth recalling sociology's so-called Thomas theorem, namely that, quote, if men define situations as real, then they are real in their consequences, end quote. Such sincere convictions suggest that the hyperbolic use of scientific metaphor by critics belies a vertical relation between metaphor and its literal meaning, that is, where these are overlaid as structurally similar rather than dispersed horizontally like concepts in a sentence. What electrophysiology supplied as metaphor, it seems, was more than a literary device. It was a way for writers to articulate the power they perceived in Wagner's music as a material form of communication, one that remained inexplicable according to metaphysical or disembodied prime causes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I'll take it upon myself to ask the first question. Coming back to Keith Warner's production of The Ring, which we've both seen at Covent Garden in the past few weeks, the scene that you're describing in Nibelheim in the Rheingold, I think it is meant to be a reproduction of Wagner's description of science, isn't it? Folterkammer der Wissenschaft,
Indeed.
torture chamber of
Yes.
science. But isn't that really a sentimental view of it? I mean, what are the philosophical implications of what you're saying? Is the scientific impulse behind Wagner's work actually a positive? You know, the Kittler idea of it being a data processing machine is actually a positive thing for science and rather a negative thing for humanistic literature. How do you see the balance here? Because I think Warner got it wrong, really.
Oh, interesting. Well, I think Wagner's position is quite complex because, of course, I think he remained an idealist, and in these later writings, the essay to which you refer, I think indicates that he was certainly aware of these kinds of processes, and clearly he was aware of contemporary research. But of course, he rejected these at every stage in his writings in terms of the idealism he expressed, particularly in relation to concepts of genius and inspiration and so on, but I think also in other areas. As to whether it's a positive or negative element, for Wagner, I think he almost becomes anachronistic, I think, later in the century in rejecting what by this stage is an enormously prestigious advent of the growth of the natural sciences. I think whether we interpret productions such as Warner's now in light of this, I think it is a playful matter, and I think we have scope to do that. I was taken by the production for precisely the reason that it engages with the discourse. I think whether, because there have been a number of...
It's a grand phrase, engaging with the discourse. I like it.
but as opposed to, for example, domesticating the ring,
yes.
and which has also occurred in other
But surely, in the reality of Wagner's works, I think Kittler is absolutely right here, is a systematic one. If you study his working methods, quite contrary to other composers, you see just how different he is in the scientific way he puts together the music drama. There's a paradox there. So he may be talking about the torture chamber of science on the one hand, but in fact the reality of his works, in my view, and I think Kittler is very perceptive here, is actually against this humanistic tradition that calls science a torture chamber. That's why I found Warner going along with that old thing, really a sentimental gesture, because Wagner is actually much more present. In the digital age, we can say this now.
Yes.
And I think this is the implication of what you're saying, isn't it?
Yes, I think so. I think we can release Wagner from these idealistic shackles which he himself has constructed. I think the very string of references that you can find and in fact topics in his works that are so clearly beholden to sort of aesthetic ideas which are much earlier in the century, and I think have tended to cloud our judgment in this. But I think the insight that in fact there are feats that only technology would allow, even within the plots of the opera, is one way in. The kind of stage dramaturgy that Warner has produced is another, though of course it could be more interesting. In fact, in that production, when Lorga is explaining how they're going to get around the problem of Wotan's unfortunate bargain, he uses a slideshow, a magic lantern effect. So there are all kinds of different technologies brought to good effect there, and I think this has the double function of being true to the 1890s in that sense, but also it serves the function of demonstrating that Lorga's dazzling the observing gods into
well,
taking his view.
A lot of people in the room who haven't seen Keith Warner's production, so let's put it to the floor. Sana.
Yes, thank you. That was very, very interesting.
Thank you.
Just to be clear then, what you're saying is that the writers use these metaphors to explain the effects of Wagner's music, and then this discussion that you've just been having with John is about what Wagner himself thought, and at the beginning of your paper that you said he was not a materialist.
Indeed, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, but then on the other hand, that maybe his aesthetics and then his actual practice were two different things. Is that kind of what you were saying there?
Well, my sense of it is that we can actually read Wagner against the grain in this sense, that I think he, if one, the one phrase I plucked out of opera and drama here was referring to the way in which Wagner explains a melody as physically present to the person who delivers it as it is to the person who receives it. Now, there aren't many examples of phrases like that, because I do believe that Wagner remained an idealist, for better or worse. But I also feel like in the 21st century, we're moving so far away from a composer-centric view of ways of approaching composers' works and legacy, that I think there's license for us to, in fact, as I say, read Wagner against the grain and see to what extent the prestige of the natural sciences, in fact, is traceable, albeit without his permission, if you see what I mean.
I think we've always, I think even during Wagner's lifetime, we were reading him against the grain, weren't we? Another question? Sorry?
Oh, wait, that's the question.
Yeah, I did.
Sorry. Okay.
You forgot the question? What was it?
All right. So, yes, the prestige of the natural sciences over the second half of the 19th century increased tremendously. And then, but we still have this metaphysics. And so when we come to his essay Beethoven, and he's trying to explain creativity, and he completely relies on Schopenhauer for his scientific explanation of how creativity works. And so it's just so curious how there's a split between the real science stuff that's happening here and then the lingering metaphysical kind of science of Schopenhauer.
It's a peculiar wedding and I think it does persist as an uncomfortable kind of
it is a kind of cultural schizophrenia in some ways, isn't it?
I think, yeah, it's a good way of putting it. Yes.
That's what you're trying to get at.
But it's a very important
point. I think we just
so.
need to move on. Is anybody else got a question? Yes.
Thank you, David. Thank you very much that you made up this, made us see this horizon of a history of knowledge, actually, behind, which might be, which might have to be read against the grain. But my question is more towards the Wagnerian audience. How far did you find these metaphors, these electrophysiological metaphors, or this telephone metaphor in this discourse? My impression was with all this discussion about the leitmotifs that they never used such a metaphor because it was just the wrong metaphor. It was a technical, materialistic metaphor. So how? But the leitmotif reception, as you know, I'm reading as a kind of instruments against these amazing sensuous offers of this music. So to have a semantic instrument against it. Have you found really many of these metaphors? And would you even say that the Nietzsche one is also, it's a polemic metaphor. It's in a way the wrong metaphor for Wagner. He uses the telephone. There is something aggressive in this, calling it a telephone.
Absolutely. I mean, if I begin with the last point you make there, quite. I mean, as I mentioned, I think it's a real clash of metaphysics and technology, and deliberately so from Nietzsche. To get to your first point, whether Wagner was actually aware of the use of this kind of metaphor is something that I'm not able to answer. I mean, there may well indeed be experts here who could answer that. So raise your hands. I haven't come across any explicit correspondence to that effect. So that's one point. A second point, though, would be that Wagner was also very surprised, I think, by the physical effects of his music on listeners. There's a report he writes, it's 3 or 4 women, I think, reacting to Tannhäuser in the early 1850s. vomiting, convulsing, in tears. That is commonly, of course, linked to hysteria, and that's quite a separate discourse. But he writes that this is entirely unexpected. So that's the other point that I would add, though, is that there are ways in which we can see a real engagement with this kind of knowledge, and that is that through medical treatments. So Wagner knew, for example, that Berlioz had had electric shock treatment. In 1859, he writes about seeing him with a very pained expression on his face. And in 1882, we find Cosima reporting, and I'm not sure what lies behind this. It would be interesting to find out more. But Cosima reports that Wagner had had electric treatment, so presumably some sort of current passed through his body. Nietzsche's physician, Otto Eiser, recommended in 1879 that he, in fact, have a course of electric treatment. So this was something that was quite a bit more normal, perhaps, than we might assume. So that could be a point to engage with it.